welcome also from my side to this last session of our Co-Change conference on Co-Change, which is the H2020 RRI project Co-Change, and about Co-Change, which is about the idea to change together our institutions and our organizations in a way so that we are supporting the transformation in the sense of sustainability transformations. We have, I think, a very interesting panel ahead of us, which is a little bit unusual, perhaps, for conferences like that, but it shouldn't be unusual for conferences like that, because most of the time in Europe, we are talking about Europe, which is somehow logical, but on the same hand, since globalization is not really a new concept, and even if we see changes in the way of globalization, which might even lead to a deglobalization at the very moment, it is a fact that we are all interlinked very much, and we know that, as we have been talking about already earlier in the conference, not only our problems are global, but obviously then also our solutions must be global. So when we are talking about responsible innovation, it might be a little bit surprising that we very often are talking especially about Europe, and amongst Europeans talking about the RRI concepts and the problems we have in Europe, and the chances we have and the solutions we have in Europe. In any case, we would like to have a session that takes a different tack. We would like to have a session which actually is looking at the future of RRI beyond Europe. And we have a lineup that is, I think, really interesting in that respect. To my right, you see Justine Lacey. And I have to read this because this is, you're the director of the Responsible Innovation Future Science Platform. And I won't spell out the name of the organization Justine is being the director of this future platform for. But the acronym is CSIRO, and it suffices to say that this is the National Science and Technology Agency of Australia. We have online Penny Haworth, who until very recently has been the senior project coordinator of the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity. She's retired now since a very short time, and she still is a very knowledgeable researcher when it comes to responsible innovation, to RRI, and she has a very good overview over RRI practices. She has been part of many different projects, and I'm very happy to have her also here with us.
Thank you.
And we also have here Erik Fisher, who's at the Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation, and a number of other bodies and institutions and platforms at the Arizona State University. And I think he's quite well known also in the RRI community for a number of things. Being the editor of a very important journal, being the creator of a very important set of methods, being the teacher of this set of methods and other things for many RRI scholars around the world. And so we are also happy to have him here with us. I should put my glasses on, but I have the feeling that Dafna is not with us at the moment. No? Oh, yes, she is. Dafna, there you are. Hello.
Yes,
welcome.
Apologies for the delay, but I'm here.
No problem. It's just that on the screen I can see you only partially at the moment, which is not a problem for the others in the room. I think this is just the vision that I've here, the view that I've here. Dafna Feinholz is also with us. She's the Chief of Bioethics and Ethics of Science and Technology a unit at UNESCO. And she also has a very interesting position, and she had an interesting role, as of recently, especially for me, interesting, in the first international agreement on artificial intelligence, on the ethics of artificial intelligence that has set standards that is really global. And I just can hope that she is also going to touch in her opening statement or in one of the replies this role, because I'm personally very interested in your experiences there, and we are very happy to have her with us. Yes, so a nice lineup and a few questions for the people that are here. The first question being, of course, since now our experts are coming from Australia, from the United States, and from UNESCO and South Africa. In Europe, we are talking always about responsible research and innovation, and you all are aware of that. We, on the other hand, are aware of the fact that this is a term that not only has caused all kinds of troubles over the last 10 years here with us in Europe, because nobody exactly understood what it was other than the scholars doing it. And even we had discussions amongst ourselves what it exactly entails. But on the other hand, in other parts of the world, you're not using this term, but you're using other terms for it, but they also have to do with science education, the involvement of the public, research integrity, and ethics, and gender relations, and open science, and sustainability research, etc., etc. So one question for the panel would be, we know that we have different concepts, we have different terminologies. What is the difference in the doing in your quarter of the world? And especially in the case of UNESCO, which is covering all of the world through its accord. What are the differences that you are observing there when you're looking, especially for the differences between the North and the South? Yeah, perhaps begin my tour de table with, Erik is not looking at me, perhaps with Penny.
Right. Thank you, Peter. It's quite a tricky question that. In fact, you've stolen some of my thunder, because I was going to bring up the issue of terminology. But I think, if I understand your question correctly, the difference is in the doing. In other words, really, it doesn't matter what you call this thing, as long as what is being done on the ground is actually making a difference. So I think in terms of the language and the terminology or the semantics of RRI, what has happened in the South African context is that it was recognized quite early on that academically and within the context of the people who were working in RRI, the terminology was fine. But when you take it out and you're trying to involve researchers and trying to explain to policymakers or the public what this is about, you have to use terminology that they can understand and apply. So in South Africa, and I'll talk about this a bit later on, we really are looking at what we are calling an engaged research paradigm. But that actually brings in all the principles of responsible research and innovation and shares the goals and aims. So I hope, as a brief answer, I hope that's helpful.
It certainly is. Many thanks. I also find the term very interesting, the engaged research paradigm, because it is much more telling than is responsible research and innovation, perhaps. But it sounds much less learned, I would say. So probably it was not invented by an academic, I fear. I see
No,
that.
yeah, I think so. I'll give a little bit of background later on as to how we came to take that view of it. Unless you want me to go into detail now.
Actually, you could give us a little bit more of an insight right now. It's no problem.
Sure. I think just picking up on what I've followed. Unfortunately, I couldn't sit in on this morning's session, but definitely points that resonated with me from yesterday, from day one, was and these are just things that I found as highlights. Reflection is such a necessary starting point for any kind of planning for change. And I think when our RRI journey began, this was one of the things that we had to do. We had to look at the context we were working within, and to what extent the principles that we were trying to explore were already entrenched. And I think in some ways South Africa had a bit of a head start, because we've been dealing with issues of equity, change, gender and race equality, etc., for a long time. So transformation, certainly in the organization I was working in, which was part of the National Research Foundation, issues of transformation, relevance, etc., had been on the agenda for quite a long time. So we kind of got to the point where we realized there was no, and this was a message that came out over and over again, for us, there was no need to reinvent the wheel as such, but what we needed to do was try to fast track and put into policy some of the principles, using the terminology of RRI. And so that was a starting point. And out of that has come, I would say, in the last 2 to 3 years, a very strong push for participatory research, collaborative engagement, and of course sustainability is a major feature of all of this. So yes, I think we started with looking at ourselves, and then it grew from there. And so now what has happened is that we actually have formalized these ideas into various frameworks, excuse me, within the National Research Foundation, driven by the strategy of the Department of Science and Innovation. So we've got very high level buy-in to all of this. And the National Research Foundation is the major funding body of research in South Africa. So once it's written into the funding paradigm, it means that the universities and anyone applying for research funding needs to start thinking about how they're going to integrate these principles into their research. And because we have lots of very dire social issues, poverty, a floundering economy, and all sorts of the other things, research cannot happen in isolation or in a vacuum. It has to be part of the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. This certainly was a very interesting input. I saw Erik nodding earlier about some of the comments that you have been making. Erik, may I ask you next?
Yes, happy to, Peter. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'll just try to keep my comments to under 5 minutes. Just to give an overview of the US situation. And I want to start with the observation that it was 20 years ago, in 2003, that the US Science Policy Institution more or less invented the idea of responsible development of nanotechnology. And this was a very productive period of about 10 years. There were many policy changes in social science, and changes in science and engineering. And so this program led to numerous developments of tools, case studies, and capacities. And some would argue this really laid the foundation for what became RRI. But in any case, there was a lot of critical, reflexive, anticipatory dimensions that were tested out and in some cases implemented and developed in the research and development processes around the nation. However, responsible development lasted about 10 years and it wasn't really replaced with anything else, which is very interesting because this was a government-led governance framework similar to technology assessment, ELSI, which became ELSA. As you can see that the US government is very good at inventing these governance frameworks, but not necessarily very good at implementing them. And so since the 10 years, the last 10 years, there hasn't really been anything that's taken its place. There's been something of a void, and this could be problematic, but it could also be seen as an opportunity. One shift that has occurred is government's frameworks and the moral high ground for assuring the responsibility of research and innovation has shifted. It shifted from government-led to industry-led. And we can see this in movements among the tech workers for things like technology for good or tech for good, humane technology or humane tech, but also in investors who are investing in a little bit of responsible technology and responsible innovation. Even things like Facebook have adopted the notion of responsible innovation and created a team. There's been something called trust and safety work, which many of the big tech industrial giants have developed also teams for trust and safety. And there's been some study of the activities. However, it's important to know that none of these industry-led developments are very reflexive, very critical, very anticipatory. They're not necessarily focused the way that they would have been with more academic involvement. Another development has been coming from private philanthropy, and this has involved some academic cooperation as well. And it's around the notion of public interest technology, or PIT. This is similar to public interest law, the idea that we can use technology to address grand challenges, except that there's, again, no real sense of unintended consequences. There's not a critical view of technology. There's just a sense that technology is this powerful force, let's use it for things that are good. And there's a big university network around PIT. Arizona State University, where I teach, is one of them. So another shift is that there's been a political, as you might have heard, there's been sort of political polarization in my country that has rocked the world. And this has also shown up in the science policy arena. Not only is there a lack of government-led activities, but there's strong political pushback by the political right against things like corporate social responsibility, green investing, woke corporations, and whatnot. And so there are very active efforts to sort of clamp down activities in the private sector that are focused on clean and green and sustainable investing and whatnot. So this leaves us in a very precarious position. And I think we'll share the what to do about it. That's probably coming later in the session. So I'll stop there.
Many thanks. Justine.
I'm surprised. Yeah, I'm watching the TV. Yeah.
It's a little bit like TV. I should explain that we are sitting in an auditorium, and right adjacent to us on the other side of the room, on the back side of the auditorium, so to speak, there's a large monitor, and we see the faces of Erik and Dafna and Penny on there. But we see also a little bit in a small reflection our own room here. So I'm turning to you.
Okay.
About the situation in Australia.
All right. You know what? I thought I would give you almost a little bit of the origin story. So, I mean, it's incredibly generous of you to have me here, because I've taken a lot from Europe and European colleagues in the kind of the journey of landing RRI as something just in my organization. And so I'm not going to try and represent the whole of Australia here. I'm just going to talk about a particular journey that we've been on. And so I'll give you the whole name of the place where I work, and you can see why we call it CSIRO. So it's the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. And I'm saying it out because the industry and that connection with industry is actually very important to the way we do this applied, research in Australia, and it's across a huge range of areas. I was looking at the kind of the brief about it, and it's apparently I work in one of the largest multidisciplinary science and technology organisations in the world. If you haven't heard of it, don't feel bad, because now you have. It's about 5,500 staff. We're working across 58 sites. Most of them are in Australia, but there also is one in Silicon Valley, there is one in France, and there is another in Chile. So I think inside that context of a national science agency, in about 2017, we kicked off a particular kind of funding, a particular internal funding program, which is called our Future Science Platforms. And so that's a really fancy name. What's a Future Science Platform? I think of it actually as an internal investment that we make in certain areas of science. These platforms are ephemeral. They last around 5 years generally. They're competitive, they're collaboratively developed internally. And these really are internal areas of science, because we feel like they're areas that are non-competitive at the moment. But if we were to pour some kind of energy and time and resourcing into them, they could become, what we might think of as game-changing areas of science for Australian industry. And that's the focus. What is the kind of investment in science and technology do we need? What is the, almost to use colonial language, the frontier efforts in science that we should be making as a national science agency? And so when they first kick off, the four that stand up are synthetic biology. There's another one called active integrated matter, which is about the future of manufacturing combined with big data, and what is that going to look like in the future. Probing biosystems, which is about sensors inside on the body to kind of help with disease prevention and kind of predictive sort of relapses and things like that. And digital agriculture. So they're the four. And so as those four stand up, one of the questions that our board raises, so from the very sort of top of the organisation, is, are we prepared enough to think about the societal impact of our own portfolio of science? Here we are intentionally trying to be disruptive. And everyone, well, nature says we're not that disruptive. Here we are trying to be disruptive in ways that we think are attractively disruptive, that are going to create new opportunity for existing industry, that maybe will create not only new industry, but like change what we've got going on now. But they're also considered to be an investment in our science capability. And if we're talking about future science, what does the future scientist of our organisation look like? So you've got this double-barreled, we want to kind of create new science and technology. We're changing the capability of our organisation in different ways, and they tend to be multidisciplinary ways. Who do you need to bring in to solve some of these challenges? And we hope it's going to shape Australian industry. So it's really ambitious, right? But there are some questions. And synthetic biology kind of taps into some of the GM story, right? Well, what if, we as the trusted advisor to the nation on science create something that somehow compromises that position? What if the way we kind of push science and technology forward isn't something that the Australian public wants, needs, or is quite vocal about, telling us? And so there's at first a little conversation about, are we ready? Have we prepared ourselves appropriately? And what does that look like? And so RRI drops into a space in that particular conversation, not as a future science platform in its own right, but as something that's capturing a particular gap in the way we're initially thinking about future science and technology. So I'll stop there because that gets complicated, it arrives.
I think it is complicated enough as it is.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with responsible innovation, life normally is complicated, so we're not surprised by that part. Dafna, may I turn to you? You're in a special place. It's a United Nations organization, and you're dealing with the whole world. You're not only looking at a single national innovation system, as complicated as it might be, and you have been involved in these discussions between what we now are used to call the global north and the global south. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'll try. So I think, first of all, I will try to get to start from the terminology, as you were saying, no? So it's interesting to know that this concept of RRI was developed basically in the European context as part of the European Commission funding program of Horizon 2020, and it was to align research innovation with European values. And then we have heard how it has been resonated and adapted or trying to be developed and interpreted in different contexts. But I think coming, as you said, from an international organization that is dealing with the all this wide range of countries, I think it still remains a need to localize the practices and values around what would be understood as RRI. It's not only about the technology and the words that sometimes are not so, because I agree with Penny, no, I mean, sometimes you have to, or these acronyms or these terminologies, and then you have to make them understood. But I think it's more than making the sense of the word is, or the concept, it is about really adapting to local conditions and to localize the practices and values of the global South countries to ensure that there is inclusiveness in this RRI, and it needs, and so it implies, for example, to be open to a more bottom-up and grassroots community-based approach where appropriate. And there has been different studies about what does that mean in the north, in the south, and in some middle countries in development, talking about development, for example, Malawi, Brazil, and the Netherlands. So basically, it's important to focus RRI-like initiatives in the global south. Sorry, because I'm having some troubles with my... So they can help fill the gaps and support the elaboration of a more multicultural perspective of what do we mean with responsible research. Then to align science and society in ways that include a potentially underrepresented stakeholder and practices. I think this is what UNESCO is really about, is trying to bring in the voices of everyone that is involved or left behind, basically. There are some countries in Africa, and South Africa is a good example, where there is much more infrastructure, but you have many other countries where you don't have even the basic access to education in technology, where you have zero infrastructure to develop technologies, where you don't have possibilities for researchers to do research, or where we still have these practices of research that is funded from the outside, that is coming to the country to do research, but they don't build the capacities of the local researchers, and they don't leave anything behind in terms of infrastructure in the countries. And then the researchers in many of the global south do not have the same opportunities also to publish even. So there is a gap, an extreme gap between the possibilities of develop and develop these technologies and participate in these developments, even from the researchers, but not also only researchers. For example, we held some consultations where in the process of developing the recommendation of ethics of AI, and we were listening in some of the African countries and also in other regions of the world, that even the startuppers or some enterprises or some people that wanted to do something, they lack the confidence of their own government, the support of their own governments and their own people. So they go and look for what is done before outside their countries. So we need to start from the basics in many of these countries, which is access to education, information on FCI. There is, and then all these people that are very talented, they of course, there is the syndrome of the brain drain that is still happening a lot. So I think this is very important, and I believe this is also very closely linked to more awareness raising, something that UNESCO is also calling for a lot always, is about engagement of the community and the civil society to be very, very aware of what is happening. And you wanted me to speak, I don't know exactly how on what about the process of the recommendation, but I'm happy to answer any specific question that you want to ask me any time, because this is what we're talking about. But I just wanted to add something. As UNESCO, we have also been involved in some of these projects funded by European Commission involving ERRI. But I think something that always brings UNESCO brings into the table is one of the specific mandate that we have, which is the ethics of science and technology, which sometimes when we speak about ethics, people think it's about impeding or infringing upon innovation or putting some, but I think that, it was interesting to listen about the different terminologies developed of human development of research and innovation, but I think the most what it is very specific about ethics, what is the mandate here, is about making sure that, or making explicit that everything that we do is linked to values. So when we say human, yes, nobody will contest, because human, everybody will say, yes, human and sustainable for the environment. Who will contest this? But what does this really mean? How is it really put in practice? As some of the predecessor speakers also said, there are many principles, there are many things. How do we really put them in practice? So I think the most important is also to make sure that we understand which kind of values we are either supporting or ignoring when we are proposing some specific technology or some for development of research and innovation, and particularly when we are developing technologies that are also taking decisions for ourselves, like in artificial intelligence. What is behind all that, and what kind of regulations that we need to put in place, and what kind of overview needs to be there. So we need to be responsible for the technology we are developing, but based on the expectations of the world and society that we want to have. And this view of the society doesn't belong to only one stakeholder or one voice. It is really a very wide, it's a multidisciplinary, multisectorial, and it's completely, it needs to be diverse and comprehensive discussion in order to decide where we want to go as the world. So just to finalize, let me tell you that, for example, when we developed this recommendation of ethics of artificial intelligence, we also provided with not only values and principles, but also with very concrete policy actions and 2 tools to monitor to help the implementation, which is the readiness assessment methodology, which is like trying to understand first where the country stands. And also because the recommendation covers the whole life cycle of the technology. So where is the country stand, in meaning that, is this the best solution, for example? And I think it applies not only to artificial intelligence, right? It's like, do we really need this technology to solve its problem? Are we ready? Do we have the knowledge? Do we have the policies in place? Do we have the mechanisms to follow? Do we have mechanisms to consult the society, etc.? And then we have the other one, which is the ethical impact assessment, which is like, once the technology is conceived, the research done, then deployed, then also measure the impact, again, in a very wide spectrum of people who and the societies and stakeholders and the shareholders, and then being able to adapt it or to make decisions, even if you want to decide to stop using technology. I will stop here because there are many other things, but I don't know exactly what you want me to say, and I hope I answered more or less the question.
Thank you very much. I think you covered a lot of ground, and interesting ground it was. Now, since the time has progressed a little bit already, I would suggest we go first into a round of question and answers, and then see if we go into a second round with the panel with a question coming from us. Are there any questions on the side of the participants here in the room?
There is actually a question in the chat from Angela Simone. Would you like to say it out loud, or should I read it for you, Angela?
As you prefer, just a quick question to Erik about the role and the potential impact of Alondra Nelson on RRI-like policies in US, because her role was quite new in the US landscape. So with this commitment for science and society relationships. So I was curious to know if there are some policies, projects, programs implemented or designed by Alondra Nelson related to RRI or RRI-like processes.
Yes, thank you, Angela, for this excellent question. Because Alondra Nelson has a very strong social science background and has been very active in the science and technology studies community before she came to this White House position. And she actually was the deputy director, whereas the director had to step down after a few months because of some scandal. But her ascension, first as deputy director and now director, has been really positive, and it sent a very strong message to the social science community that their voice matters and that their work matters. And Alondra has been very active in giving talks, for instance, for this community, and has been working very hard to bring about change. I'm not really an expert on the work she's been doing, but I can tell you that so far it has not led to any federal or national-wide policies of the type that we could compare to RRI or responsible development.
Thanks a lot, Erik.
Yes, Julia.
I have a question for, I don't know, whoever wants to answer within the panel, although it starts with the comment that Erik made, that is that when we look, the current best case scenario is when we look at technology and we try to steer it towards solving some, societal issue, thinking that technology is inherently good, whereas the process probably matters as much as the results of this of the innovation process. So I was, and maybe that's a mistake that we do when we provide funding, and among the criteria of the call for funding, we only include elements that describe the expected results, the expected output, the expected solution. So I was wondering whether anybody has suggestions of what we should do better when designing call for proposal. Should we include requirements on the process? Should we keep it simple and say just as we say in your team there has to be at least a gender balance? Should we say that in your research team there needs to be a balance among the different expertise, including social scientists? I'm just looking for ideas. Anybody has them?
Who would like to answer? I see a couple of heads nodding. Erik is nodding. Dafna is nodding.
I can go if that's okay, Peter.
Please.
Yeah, no, I love this question. I think it's really vital. And this is where I think we have to pay attention to two things. One is just the general importance of we call it implementation, but really it's practices and choices made by individuals and small groups, organizations, different cultures, and the sort of bottom-up work that has to meet and complement the top-down requirements. And then the other is that we want some diversity, I think, because it's not always clear what is going to be effective, what people are going to be able to implement, find useful, and whatnot. So if we're premature and on the top down, we say you have to do RRI and you have to do it in this way, okay, maybe that's perfect, maybe it's not perfect, but if we have different varieties, whether it's national or regional or organizational or sectoral, then we can sort of take an experimental approach and allow things to bubble up. And so I think, you know, allowing for creativity, innovation, and risk-taking, sort of strange words to use when we're thinking about criticizing innovation and technology, but we also have to have some of these. And maybe it's important to notice how much capacity we've built up in the last 10 years because of the RRI initiative in Europe. There's so much capacity. So maybe the question is to find out what this capacity is and to build on that. So maybe the process requirement should be to make the individuals and the funded organizations say, this is the capacity we have for interdisciplinarity, for inclusion, for value sensitivity, and this is how we propose to use it. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I also want to come in and to echo what Erik just said, and I think it's fundamental what you just said. I think the process is as important, if not more, of the result. And because of that, because of the diversity, because of the pluralism, because even when we speak about benefit sharing, when we used to speak about the research about it, what does it mean? I mean, for whom? How is it defined? And that's why I was probably too fast, but this is exactly, well, I can tell you how we developed, for example, this recommendation. First of all, there was an independent experts group of experts from all the regions of the world, with different backgrounds, gender balance, and then not representing any government, preparing a draft. Then we went for a process of consultation that it took of months. We did in phase. Well, it was via Zoom because it was during the pandemic, so it was not easy. But we did regional consultations with all the potential stakeholders, civil society for sure, making sure that there is that they were gender balance, etc., etc. We went also online, private sector, academics, everything what you want, and decision makers. And then we went online also. We got more than 50,000 comments, plus the whole UN system. And then it went into the second draft. And then only then it went to the negotiation of the representatives of governments. So what governments got already to start the negotiation was the result of a super inclusive process, and with the Global South, because it was 193 countries involved in the negotiation, but many more stakeholders from all of those countries in the consultations. And this is exactly what we embedded in the recommendation. For example, there is a multi-stakeholder governance. It's one of the policy actions, and one of the methodologies to implement and monitor the recommendation includes when I said ethical impact assessment is particularly that. Go and ask everyone in the community, whatever, researchers, different ages, groups that are marginal, never ask their opinions. What is the impact of this technology on them? And agriculture will be very different than in education. It will be completely different in different domains and from different people and in different cultures. There are cultures that that are the relationship between culture and technology varies a lot between Japan, for example, and some country in Latin America with some indigenous population. And it doesn't mean that they won't be accepting the technology, but I just think that this diversity is vital. In a way, it's what is embedded in the ethics. So the process for me with all this is really crucial. And I would definitely go, for example, when we do for example, the ethical impact assessment, and with this I will stop. The entry point will be the procurement process. So this technology that you are buying, was it developed with a diverse group? I mean, more or less the same questions that you said before about, are we going to fund this project? More or less the same questions. So just to make you, to give you an idea that this is exactly what we're trying to put in place.
So Dafna is saying that diversity and inclusiveness plays a role not only with research funding, but also with other processes, like with intergovernmental negotiations, as in this case for the AI ethics court of the UNESCO. So what is your take? I also heard that you had a reaction on this question that Julia has been asking.
Probably less about the funding, but I wanted to kind of address that. I don't think the process is always missing, but they're joining up to the outcome, I think, sometimes. So I'm going to fast forward through 3 years of pain and not tell you exactly what happens in my organisation. But we start to say RI has to be driven through our organisation as applied scientific research. And where we feel our gap is around, you know, how equipped we are to deal in a systematic way with the social and potentially the ethical risks or challenges that are, you know, put forward by the science and technology that we choose to kind of pursue. And so for us, it has to be science. And if I kind of just drop into the digital portfolio, and particularly the AI, it's obsessed with process. It's obsessed with showing me through software engineering how we can do an ethical process. It's a showstopper when I say, what does it feel like for me at the end? What's your ethical outcome when you deliver this software into the world? And so that kind of gap sometimes between, and so the process, they've got all the detail, like they can tell me every step of the way. But the execution and how it will join to the ethical outcome, I actually think that's where the work is for AI. Because you can talk to Atlassian, who's reviewing their responsible innovation strategy at the moment, and you know what's available online is really about software engineering by design, and that's where RI happens for them. And I think in some places, in some scientific portfolios, we're more practiced in the process than the outcome. And I think the joining up of those two things, that doesn't help for funding application necessarily, but because we fund this internally through our own work. But it's certainly a gap that I felt looks different across the scientific portfolios for our organisation.
Good, thank you. Caroline, there are more questions from the online audience.
Yes, we have a question also to Justine in the chat, and maybe Mira would like to ask a question herself.
Sure, if I can unmute myself, and maybe for you to understand a little bit the background or context of my question as well. So I work at IBM Research in a very newly formed responsible inclusive tech team, and so yeah, I think some of the challenges that Erik has pointed to we're facing, and we're trying to change and have a very different stance. So we're very much not CSR, is what I'm going to say, and I'm doing research on responsible quantum specifically. So I was just curious because Justine, you've emphasized obviously that CSIRO is working with industry, and so I was wondering whether you have any sort of best practices where RRI practices or similar are taken up by technology industry and are taken seriously and are integrated in the processes. I mean, you've hinted to it in your previous comment, but where it's really, Erik mentioned that, you know, often in the tech industry, there are these processes, but they're not critical or self-reflexive enough. So I'm wondering whether you or any of the other panelists have sort of best practices in mind where you think around the globe, you know, tech companies should be taking this as example, because one of the experiences I'm making is that it's all good, but as soon as you come with an actual process or you try to implement it, and you're wanting to change ongoing processes or things how research and development are happening at the moment, that's where it's getting very tough.
Okay, and Mira, we've met, right? We've met.
We have.
Global governance guidelines. Yes, yes.
Yes.
So this is a good question. I'm in the fortunate position where I don't have the pressure to work with industry yet, because we're still proving this up in our view as a scientific capability inside our organization. I'm in a position where I can have conversations with, you know, whether it's a forum or whether it's a company. But in terms of projects, we're still experimenting, and that's been a very important part of the RRI work for us. It's me anecdotally saying I see differences in the portfolio of RRI inside my organisation across genetics, across digital, and across the environmental scale interventions, and they start to converge really quickly, of course. So for a best practice, I'm not going to stick my head out on a limb yet, but I think quantum is an interesting one. And if I just look at even the stage of quantum research in Australia, and it's a small part of the research, you know, the global research sector, there's still that nervousness that we might have seen in other industries, because they're about to go from, you know, years and years, millions of dollars of R&D to do this really difficult work into a commercialization stage, right? So startups, you know, professors spinning out companies, that's all really happening in Australia. And all of a sudden, you know, you're not just in the kind of the closed sphere of where it was safe to work. You're coming out, you know, and other people have commentary, and there are policies and strategies being created in Australia about quantum, as there are all around the world. And that's actually quite exposing for the researchers who do that work. And so when I saw the quantum conference last year, there was almost like that ethics versus innovation conversation, which feels tired and old. But it was very palpable in that conference, where they'd say, oh, regulation, no, we're innovating here. Ethics, no way, we're innovating here, because they hadn't had enough time, at least. And I'm just speaking from kind of what I observed at that conference. And so quantum's quite a specific one. So Mira, you're probably in a better position inside IBM to be kind of telling us what the challenges are that we should think about as researchers, I think.
There was almost a question in the end to the online participant, to Mira. If you would like to say something about that,
yeah.
You may. You don't have to.
Sure. Yeah, I think, I mean, I agree, and I think in terms of the challenges, I mean, I think quantum is different, but my question was actually aimed broader. So to sort of tech companies in general, I guess my question is, have any of the participants, or, you know, have you seen, is there good RRI practices at a tech company? And I'm sorry to narrow down the focus, but that's of course what I'm interested in. That is working really well, that is critical, that is self-reflective, and that is not just CSR. So that's kind of what I was aiming for. But Justine, I very much agree that what I'm also facing, so I'm researching on responsible quantum at IBM, and it's very much this sense of, but we can't think about ethics, because that will just, ethics is, first of all, ethics is equated to regulation, and regulation is necessarily bad because it will necessarily stifle innovation. And it's kind of, I get from a lot of people, this is too early to think about, because we need to make the innovations first. And I mean, I think on the other hand, you can see that I'm allowed to do this kind of research, so it also shows that there is some sort of support for this. But yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how much this can actually be integrated in the research and development processes, especially at this very crucial moment in time where quantum is getting out to society. And I really liked how you're saying that there's the spotlight on the researchers who suddenly are faced by kind of wider society. And maybe you can even say that shouldn't have been like this. The wider society should have been more attuned or attentive to quantum earlier. But I think that's something that we need to bring into tech corporations. And to answer the question, what are the challenges? This is one of the challenges. So to kind of convince that thinking about these issues now, thinking about social issues also, what you were mentioning, Dafna, thinking about, you know, not only working with developing countries and do a nice project, but then leaving something behind and actually having enabling them rather than do one project and then it was nice and we say goodbye. These are very much the challenges I'm seeing.
If I may complement a little bit, is it okay? Yeah, I like a lot your question, Mira, and your reflections and what you said now. And yes, I'm very happy that you picked up also on the last part of not leaving them there alone after the research is done. But I think you also touched upon two things that are super important. I mean, private companies also are all the time thinking about, or industry, about self-regulation as is enough. But I think that we have been already seeing the downsides. And as you said, if some of them adhere to some good practices are probably only to avoid reputational risks, but it's not really because they are convinced. And you also said something that is critical, that everyone says that ethics, let's wait for the ethics at the end, because first we need to develop the technology and then we see the ethics, and it might be too late. And that's exactly and it's, first of all, because ethics is and it's not regulation. I mean, at the end, it should be. I think the way it is, the way I see it is like, first of all, the technological, I mean, you can develop the technology, that there is no limit for that. It's only resources and creativity, and then you can do whatever you want. But the question is, where do we want and how do we want to invest these resources and to do what? This is exactly the ethics, and this is when the ethics has to come in, and because otherwise it's too late. Then it's like Frankenstein. You produce technology and then you don't manage the technology, and when you don't understand, when you don't, it is too late, and technology is already driving society, or is already deployed in such a way that is harming us, and then there is probably no way to stop it. So it needs to be embedded, and we have seen many examples where they said we will leave the ethics at the end, and then we will think about what to do it, and it started with when all this cloning and all these developments with the DNA started, and when we saw, you remember probably the Korean infamous research that at the end everybody was very happy because they were being able to duplicate a lot of embryos, but nobody asked the question, how are they doing it? And then after that, not only it was a problem with the information, but it was clear that they were forcing women to undergo processes because they were the students, and when they were forced to be injected and be the ones to be used to produce these embryos. So if you leave the ethics at the end, you can come with these issues. And then when there is a collective reflection again of all of those who are going to be impacted by technologies, or how far do we want this technology to go, then you establish some normative framework that to protect this social agreement on where we want to go. But leaving the ethics at the end is really the most dangerous thing.
Thank you. Are there other reactions to this statement and question of Mira before?
If I may, yeah, I think it's really interesting and important to focus on industry. And on some level, I think we've been having the same conversation for decades, to be honest. And one of the exciting things about responsible research and innovation and the community that I think gave birth to it as a scholarly enterprise is that it really does learn from these discussions. And so this is part of the legacy, I think, of RRI is to really understand the complexity and the nuance and the difficulty of approaching industrial actors, because it's very difficult. Even if you have strong governmental authority, it's still very, very difficult to determine influence, let alone determine what they do and how they do it. It's really sort of an essential tension. Maybe my main comment would be on getting us back to this notion of principle versus result, or principle and product. And I think there's an interesting middle ground, because Justine made an excellent point, and that is that there's a lot of attention to the procedural steps that go into writing code, checking it, having committees, writing reports, checking with stakeholders, and these steps in the end, what do they add up to? In a way, nothing in many cases. And in a very cynical way, one could say that, the more steps you have, the more of a buffer you have from being scrutinized. But I think there's also another notion of process, and that is process as principle, or procedural principles. These are requirements, you might say, if we ask that whatever your steps are and whatever your outcomes are, please show us how you're being anticipatory. Please show us how you're being inclusive. Please show us how you're being reflexive, right? And then you have an interesting challenge to the industrial actors, because they're free to interpret this any way they want. And I mean, as Dafna was saying, they may only interpret it because they're worried about reputational risk. This is sometimes all we have to work with. We can't, necessarily hope that they're going to develop the same sort of concern that many people in this room and at this conference and in the RRI community have. So if this is what we have to work with, and we can somehow have these procedural principles in place for the actors, the industrial actors, to interpret and implement on their own, well, this is I think an important step forward. And then, if possible, to have some sort of accountability. But the accountability might simply have to be an accountability of peers. I know that this is what the National Science Foundation in the US has been doing with quantum computing. There is a requirement that big funded centers from this quantum computing and similar sort of forward-looking, I can't remember the name of the program, but they're funding these multi-million-dollar 5 to 10 year centers, and they just have a requirement for some sort of engagement. And some of these centers then adopt an RRI framework, some of them adopt an anticipatory governance framework, and then they have to present these to one another. And then there are social scientists like myself in the room to ask difficult questions. So I would say that really one of the most powerful tools we have is process principles.
Okay, bringing us back to the point that Julia has been raising quite a time before.
Can I comment on what Erik was saying?
One moment, Julia. Remarks from you? Are you content?
This is like spaghetti, like we're everywhere, right?
We are a little bit everywhere, that's correct.
Yeah. So it's roaming. And so this is one of the problems that I have when I first meet RRI. And I said this to Caroline at lunch. We thought we did the right thing. We brought a consultant in from Germany. Like, we imported the real deal, someone who knew RRI, keys, dimensions. Could we map them? How would we make sense of it? And it took me some years to throw away some of that shackle. Like, I felt so trapped by some of this structure and the context of Australia not being Europe and not having access to European Commission funding. It took me some time to realize that you could work within the knowledge base that's created here without repeating it perfectly. And so for me, that was a real struggle that I think I want to add to this discussion, because it's I have a lot of respect. I've met a lot of people here over the years. I was coming to Europe looking at technology assessment community for a long time. And so it's infused into what we do in Australia, but it could never be quite the same. But it was very hard to admit that and just go, I have to do something for Australia. I have to do something for my organization. What does it look like? And so when Julia is talking about funding, she's in that same place. What do I have to do here right now for my organization to get this done? That borrows from this and kind of it's paying homage in a way, but it looks different, and that frustrates me. it frustrates me that it moves so much,
Mhm.
but that you've all been here before, so you know.
We've been here before. Julia.
Just a quick comment on what Erik was saying. I don't know whether the panelists here were with us this morning. So I'm Julia, and I work for the Innovation Agency of the Chamber of Commerce. So I feel like I have to advocate for enterprises somehow. But anyway, I think what Erik was saying just now about, you know, the scrutiny being from peers and not necessarily from, you know, the wider community. Maybe it's not the ideal solution vis-a-vis the orthodoxy of RRI, but at the same time, we have to work with proxies in many situations. We have to work with proxies when we deal with indicators. So it's not so bad at the end of the day that at least you start the process of scrutiny from somewhere. So for instance, when we talk to enterprises and we talk about the participatory element of our RRIs, what we tell them is that they have a little universe inside themselves. Like their organization is made of people that have different background, different expertise, different life experiences. So they might start from there. They might start by opening up the innovation process within their own organization, which is maybe a stepping stone into something more meaningful. But it's not necessarily bad because it's not the whole thing. Just as having peer scrutiny from other, you know, high-tech guys, whereas it might seem that it's living outside the concerns of those that don't have the same kind of insight. It's so much better than nothing that I think we should applaud to that rather than go like, I don't know, not sure this is the actual thing, you know. So and going back to enterprises, I also think that we should kind of cut them some slacks, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who take the commercial risk of, you know, taking innovation into the market. So at the end of the day, we must demand for a participatory process as good as possible, but you know, the decision is theirs, and then we have to. What we should demand is not that they get stuck with what we think is good, but they should remain engaged and committed in a dialogue that goes on even after the innovation has been released. Because this is something that we can ask. We cannot put a veto on how they invest their money, because they're taking the risk and they're, you know, moving progress of our community forward. They're kind of creating the wealth that we hope to distribute in a fair way. So I think we should be happy also by working with proxies of the process, which is so important, because, you know, eventually we'll get there.
Thank you. Now we have some 15 minutes left in the session, and I would like to take the path that I got here on this original topic, which is the global perspective of RRI, that Justine has been making before, when she was saying, well, we had these experts from Germany here, and they introduced us to this relatively tightly knit framework of RRI interpreted in this European way, which was as much or probably less of a help for me in the long run. It was a burden, simply because it was difficult to be translated into my own quarters. May I ask the panelists for the question of, what do you think can we learn from each other? Are there things that we can take from this European approach, as well as from the Australian, the one from the United States, from South Africa, and from other countries? Or let me put the question the other way around, which made me more interesting for the Europeans. what do you think could we learn from the approaches in other parts of the world that we so happily are content to ignore in our discussions normally? Dafna, would you like to start?
Yes, first of all, you already answered in a way what I wanted to say, because the reframing of your question was what I was going to propose. I think we really need to have the two ways. It should be always reciprocal, and that's why I was saying about the necessity to localize and to open up the reflection about how RRI is conceived in different contexts. And I think there is a lot to work, but of course, and to learn from each other. I think it's both sides, both ways. I think that, and for me, that's why I could not agree so much with the last comment, for example, because for me, really, as more interaction and as the wider and diverse is the dialogue and the learning experience, the richest. And then we will not be leaving anyone behind, and then we will be, because otherwise it's always also like there is someone leading, and then we see how we can accommodate this to others, or sometimes there, and it's always somebody that might not fit. But why it should be that way? I mean, if we are really global, and then we really need to we speak about sustainability, and what sustainability? It's only environmental. Even for environment, we need the diversity to survive. So culturally, is the same. We really need diversity to survive. This is our richness, and of course, practice are some of them can be globalized, but others have to be really tailor-made. And I think everyone has something to learn from another one. So I would definitely go for a dialogue and a more and working into helping others to be more able to participate in the dialogue, but also accommodate ourselves to the way others dialogue, and then learn on the practices that they have. I mean, even for nutrition, when a nutritionist goes after graduating for university to a community, I'm speaking about the experiences we had in Mexico, where I am from, and they went to say how they should change the way they eat in order to survive, no, because that was not a good nutrition. But these people were not, they didn't have any problem with nutrition, because they had beans and they have many other sources of proteins, but they were not on the scheme that these people at the university learn about nutrition. So I think it's exactly the same way about science and technology, and then about development of research, and about everything. We need to learn from each other and to hear from one another.
So that was a flaming plaidoyer for learning from each other and for listening to each other. How would you see that? And especially, what can we learn from each other?
Ooh, I would say that everything that I have done in Australia with this research program has really been shaped by the interactions that I've had with mainly European colleagues, not only because I met Erik in Europe some time ago, before the pandemic, but being able to share the challenge, I actually think was more useful. I have university partners in Australia that prefer to stay faithful to the scholarship, and Air Dimensions are executed as Air Dimensions, and that's that, and that suits their context. We do less of the challenge sharing, I think, in the Australian context. I don't think our program would look like it looks now if I probably hadn't been able to kind of talk to some of the experience that you've had yourselves, because RRI hasn't been easy for you either, even though you kind of hold the base and the knowledge base. the fact that I come along very late in the game, that Australia starts looking at something and we kind of pick up this language, maybe I still feel guilt that I didn't execute the recipe quite the right way. But also, you know, all science is like, you know, you stand on the shoulders of giants so you can see far. And so I didn't have to kind of create everything from scratch. I had to figure out what worked. But there was always this sounding board for me, which was the rest of the world, which is a pretty fortunate place to be operating in when you're trying to do something new and transformative in your organization, right?
Good. So we hear that it pays off to stand on the shoulders of giants, Erik, and that we can look back to a rich history of what has been happening as with research that is about responsibility. And I think this resonates well with some of the earlier comments of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I really think this is such an important inflection point, and I'm really grateful, Peter, to you and the entire Co-Change project for sort of bringing these questions out right now so that we can have this dialogue. And I really want to echo Justine's phrase of challenge sharing the challenge. I think if we do nothing else, if we can strengthen the communities that the scholarly, industrial policy, activists, civil society, the communities that have always been active and behind any of these governance frameworks that have emerged, whether they're given names or not. And we happen to have a very strong global community at the moment. And I think we should really recognize what an important resource and asset it is and not take it for granted. And so to keep the community strong is really vital, but how to keep it strong? I think the key really is to discuss our challenges. We may disagree in terms of how we go about things, even why we go about things, but there's so much agreement in the room and in the community that if we focus on the struggle, because let's face it, it's an uphill battle. We're all fighting against the tide to try to make incremental or radical change or both. And so to really not just keep up moral support, but learn from one another and sharpen our own understanding. And I do think that it's in a way tragic that what I think of as dynamic, creative, and adaptive insights that can be contextually homegrown and reconfigured have turned into rigid frameworks that must be, used in a certain way. This defeats the purpose, right? The purpose is, I would say, is to somehow just be more sensitive to the values that are already being embedded in technology, so that there can be more of a conscious embedment. And the number one strategy, I think, both for researchers and entrepreneurs that we have to work with them, is to link whatever we have to give them or to tell them or to require from them, to link this to their own problem-solving activities. Whatever they're engaged in, whatever they care about, whatever they respond to, if we can develop tools and techniques and principles and incentives that help them do their job better, such that they're broadening what counts as value sensitivity, what counts as responsibility, what counts as responsiveness, then this would be my suggestion. But yeah, I really think we can learn from each other, and we should learn from each other. And so we need forums, and we need interesting provocations that really bring us to our learning edge, so that we can be more vital and effective.
Okay, thank you. So Penny, whilst Dafna is arguing for tailor-made solutions and for a dialogic way of operation, and Justine is saying, let's engage into challenge sharing. Erik is almost a little bit Tony Blairish. He's saying everything that works. What can you give us onto our future journey?
Right. Well, I agree with both. You know, it is a highly complex area. I feel I've been very quiet through this dialogue, but at the same time, it's been really, really important to listen to the different perspectives. I think what Justine was saying about context is extremely important, and Dafna was also alluding to, you know, one size does not fit all, and I think that is also very important. Erik said, you know, pick what you can and see what works for you, and I think that's very important. I was sitting here beginning to feel a little bit cynical in that I think, you know, if you look at the average age of the people in this forum, we probably all come from quite a humanistic, liberal background, and there are signs afoot that with political instability, privation, economic decline, refugees, environmental degradation, the problems are not just academic, they're very, very real, and they're certainly on the ground. And Dafna, you will know that depending on the context of the global south, a lot of what we're talking about here, it's almost impossible to even take the first step while people are still starving and living in squalor. So I'm a little bit worried about the kind of move back to conservatism. I worry that we might find that it becomes even more difficult to hear different voices while we're trying to grapple with some of those very real social and economic and environmental problems. However, I think the dialogue is key. I think getting out and talking to people, giving people a voice is very important. And also to target policymakers, because very often policymakers are not scientists. Very often they are people who certainly in our context, I think, are a little intimidated by what science is saying. And we have found certainly in the environmental sector, the doom and gloom stories actually don't work. It's far better to focus on positive stories and hopefully make people empowered to change their way. And ultimately, we want people to change their behaviors. So getting back to what Erik was saying about the process, and I think the discussion around process and ethics and that need to put ethics or values, if you like, ahead of processes is very important. And then to trust that process. Yes, it's very complicated. And in South Africa at the moment, our focus is, you know, we're beginning to conflate innovation with commercialization. And that frightens me. That really, really frightens me, because a lot of what is being said at the policy level is that, oh, well, if we innovate, we'll solve all our economic problems. And that isn't going to happen. So finding the balance and being able to talk about, you know, what will actually work is important. So thank you. It's been fascinating to listen to everybody, to hear the different contributions, but I think that dialogue is the important one in keeping the conversation going. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Penny. Caroline, we have not been saying that we do this way, but I got the idea when Penny started off and she said, well, look at us in the panel, we all, etc., etc., etc. And so I thought, well, I mean, you're certainly younger than most of us. And I thought I would like to ask you for your personal take on what you have heard in the last 1.5 hours, especially in this last round. Now that when we were talking about learning from each other, you yourself are working in the Co-Change project. You're working for the Austrian Institute of Technology, so that's as much in the global north as you can go. but you're living in the global south, actually. At the moment, you're living in Cairo, which should perhaps make for an interesting background position of yourself to all of this discussion that we are having. What is your take to what you have heard?
This comes as a surprise, Peter.
Yes, it does. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So I think the many different approaches that have been raised, they are useful if we apply them and take them as like registers, different registers that we will be able to apply in different situations. And a very important issue that was also our idea in creating this panel and should be considered more is inclusivity of different perspectives, such as, for example, the global south, and also of young people. So thank you for that. I think what we can do in regards to young people is to give young people the chance to join science earlier than we do now. Often a lot of this required, we were talking about this yesterday at dinner as well, often master's degrees required, a lot of work experience is required, but nobody wants to be the first one where you can actually gather this experience. So to include young people and also from the global south, for example, from different contexts, and include diverse perspectives. And then this makes it possible to carry on these different ideas into the different contexts and maybe also carry on ideas of RRI or related issues into the different contexts. And so it's like an exchange. It brings in diverse perspectives, but also takes then the knowledge that those possibly young people, possibly people from the global south also are able to learn and bring it back to their own contexts and then carry on those ideas. So I think this idea of inclusion is very relevant to all what we are doing. And thank you for asking me about this.
Well, I definitely can say that it is a good idea to take people on board who do not have any scientific degrees, because I did so more than 3 years ago with Caroline and with Edgar, who are both part of the team of EIT in the Co-Change project. And yes, you could just hear they are both completely fluent in RRI by now. And I actually trained RRI scholars by now, and they had no degree when they actually started, and it was always very interesting for me these 3 years to talk to both of you, because exactly you had different perspectives than my own, which is from a generation before, and that alone makes things very interesting when you're talking about new technologies such as AI. And we have the AI ethics lab at EIT established in the 3 years. So that was very valuable and continues to be a valuable source of insights for me. A valuable source of insights for me always also was the panel. I would like to thank all of you very much. Erik in the United States, Penny in South Africa, Dafna in Paris, and Justine here in Budapest, but normally in Brisbane. Thank you very much for this interesting panel. Yes, it's a wrap, I guess.